digging or doing heavy work, you couldn't be sustained over a long period of time. But they had an interest in these kids' function. So they had an interest in them prevailing at least for a time. Most of them seemed to sense that in their testimony, that this was a benefit to be here. It was less harsh than other places. I was learning something. I could even take pride in it. They were also dealing with a lot, I have to put this in, they're dealing with a lot of psychological loss. But they were together with other boys, and that was a benefit also. And people from their own hometowns, so they could actually talk about that kind of stuff. So the social fabric inside was something that also sustained them, as well as slightly better food.
I read some testimony by Edith Hahn about sawdust diets, how they mixed the sawdust in with some of the breads. Did any of them speak to you about this?
None of them complained about the food. They did say it was, insufficient, but other than that, they didn't complain about the food or its quality. They were much more likely to talk about the roll calls. They were very afraid of any time they encountered the SS. The SS were unpredictable. And so they didn't like roll calls, and they didn't like these SS visits to the barrack. If they remember episodes, it's when SS took some people away, or they remember that height test. They remember how they convinced them that they were tall enough to their head and put things in their shoes. They walked with people so that two people lifted up a third person. They did all kinds of things to get past that height test because they sensed what was going on. Those are the things that they remember rather than the everyday food. Matt?
So I'm interested in the fact that they chose the word school, Schule. I'm wondering if you think there's any element of psychological control there, in the sense that the word school would touch upon part of their pre-camp experience. They went to schools, right? There's no reason they really had to call these schools, and yet the German authorities made that choice. And I don't know if you know what were the instructors called Lehrer? Were they called teachers, or was there a different term?
That I don't know. They work. Auschwitz lists them now as teachers, but
yeah. I mean, it speaks to this tension between what is sort of a nurturing function versus the reality of the terror that you quite appropriately cite, and intercedes in these moments where there is an educational function going on, and the students are taking pride, as you say, in their work and in the education they're receiving.
It's an interesting question. To the Germans, it was a school.
Yeah.
It's listed in the Central Construction Management papers as a school. There was a formal curriculum. The building construction, the building materials took up 6 of the 8 hours. The other 2 hours were mathematics and learning German. So they were in school to learn, and every day, besides the principled stuff, they were building walls and tearing them down, building walls. They were actually learning by doing. So I think everyone looked upon it as a school. It was indoors, and it doesn't surprise me that the Nazis would look at it like a school. Since I started this project, I became sensitive to whether Mauererschulen appeared anywhere else. And there were many Mauererschulen. There's a Mauererschule in Buchenwald, started by the Nazis to train people who would build the Gustav armaments work. And many of the people who were trained there actually became part of the clandestine underground and helped save the boys later who came. So there's a Mauererschulen there. There's a Mauererschulen in Buna. There's a block with 400 boys. Nobody's written about this. Eli Wiesel wasn't in it, so it's not in Night. But there were 400 boys in a block, and they were learning to create bricks and mortar, and they were building IG4. So it wasn't unusual. It wasn't inconsistent with Himmler's views about using prisoners to build the Reich. The object wasn't to provide life, or
Right.
sustain
No,
life.
right, slave-
The
slave
object was
labor.
to sustain construction.
But the semantic choice is an interesting
Yeah.
one.
And I would like to offer you a contrast.
Yeah.
When the underground in Buchenwald created a safe haven and a barrack for boys, Block 66, where Eli Wiesel was, and other people were, they had the challenge on their hand of keeping these kids disciplined
Right.
and under their control. And so they developed a school. But their school was a very different kind of school. Their school was a school of resistance, where they used story and song to convince the kids that there would be life after Buchenwald, and that there would be people to help them afterwards, and these SS people would get their just desserts when all was done. The school took people's minds off of the fact that they were in Buchenwald. This was a different school. This was a school to serve the German project of building more camps, and more buildings and more camps. But it served a similar kind of purpose in terms of keeping them out of the worst, keeping their minds off the worst, enabling some of them to hang on in pairs or small groups, and to sustain themselves. Also afterwards, in terms of good assignments, where they might have a chance of surviving. One of the things I'm doing now is trying to find people who died. In other words, who aren't testimony givers, but using the block register and other things, trying to find out where did they die. Did they die in the Mauererschulen, in the hospital? Did they die on a project afterwards? Where were they sent? So I'm trying to deepen this. But it's just astounded me that in the construction of Auschwitz, there could be a space or a site where people could find haven.
Yeah, just my second question, thinking of comparisons, I've taken a somewhat similar research interest in the orchestras, the musicians
Okay.
of Auschwitz and the camps, and found, I haven't done the same kind of research, obviously, but similar findings about a kind of safe space where they were at the same time subjected to brutality and sadism. And I just wondered if you want to speak to that comparison?
Yeah, I think it's a very good comparison. I have taught seminars in James Madison College and gotten students to work with testimony. And every year I've done that, somebody's worked on the orchestras or music in the camps. And you're absolutely right, that the orchestra was not just a functional part of the camp, which played as people walked out and as they walked back in at the end of the day, but it was also its own space. They had their own barrack, especially the women's orchestra. And so they were together in this place, and they were bound together, bonded together by the function of providing the music. They had enough space in that barrack to practice certain things which had different meaning to them than to the SS, and maybe some prisoners would pick up on that they were playing a tune that was actually a resistance tune, or a tune that said something differently to the marches than the SS would pick up. But their primary thing was, like the teachers in the Mauererschulen, performing a service in order to be a relatively privileged prisoner functionary. And that's why I give that to students. I want them to see the kind of difficult choices that people were faced with in this environment. And they pick up on that. Raises real questions about ethics.
So you do a lot of this and talking about sort of memory and testimonies, which I assume involves absences and sort of problems, but you haven't really mentioned any of that. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the problems of memory that you found in the testimonies.
Let me preface my answer by saying that historians think in multiple different ways about this problem. some think you shouldn't lose testimonies at all, right? If it doesn't have a documentary basis, you shouldn't do it. Others think that you can use testimonies, but only those taken right after the war, close to the events. Over time, they get contaminated by people seeing Schindler's List in movies and so forth, and you're not getting their memory. A third group are worried that the testimony is given for therapeutic and familial reasons, especially the Shoah testimonies. Basically, survivors are trying to reintegrate their new personality, their new life with their old life. And so that therapeutic reasons predominate rather than historical accuracy, historical. And then there's a fourth group, and I'm in the fourth group, who think that traumatic memory in particular is enduring. And while it might not be precise as to dates or numbers or things like that, that you can use testimony, and if you find enough of them, so 20 and 15, and you read them against one another, you can find a common core of memory in that selection, especially since they're all in the same place. So I believe that is true, and that's why I do this work. It's the only way you can get into these places and see them from the bottom up as experiences. Nonetheless, there's still a set of difficulties in terms of the ellipses, the things that are left out. And nobody says that they did anything bad themselves. Nobody paints themselves in a bad light. So some of these choiceless choices that they have get left out. They get edited out. If it's also painful, in a therapeutic sense, they often skip over things. Abe Pasternak is a survivor, still alive in Detroit, he's close to 90, would come to my class every year and tell the story about how he sent his brother on the ramp at Auschwitz to be with his mother. And so he had done this thing that caused his brother's death. And then he would skip over Auschwitz. He wouldn't say anything. That was enough. And unless you have that person in front of you, you can ask some follow-up questions. You're not going to get that. And that's one of the dissatisfactions of working with these archive testimonies. I didn't mention Yakov Skurnik again, but I should have. How did I get this story about castration? Jack Aran, Yakov Skurnik, had the guts in the 1980s to write a memoir about his own castration. Right? These are things that people usually keep quiet. And this is one of the things that almost held up the Red Cross opening up access to the ITS papers. They thought people would want to protect their privacy, especially medical experiments. But he wrote a memoir about being in the Mauererschulen and being taken, having his testicles removed. He got it wrong. He said it was Mengele who did it. Mengele wasn't there in '43. We know who was doing these experiments. So the precision is absent. But even in that case where you don't expect to find that kind of knowledge, there's a memoir of a guy talking about what happened when he was taken to that block. And there are memoirs or testimonies also by guys who remained in the block and who remember him coming back. So I'm surprised at how much you can do with the testimonies, even though it's not always straightforward and reasonable.
Just to support your perspective, Charlotte Dalbeau, the French writer, says at the beginning of Auschwitz and after that everything that she doesn't promise that everything that she says will be true. She uses the word vrai, but that everything she says will be truthful. She uses the French word véridique, and she makes that distinction. And as you know, her Auschwitz and after is one of the most powerful books, and it's filled with all kinds of information. So it's a different kind of truth, the one that insists just on the facts. but an equally valuable.
I mean, it's, yeah, I mean, it wasn't, I mean, my question wasn't so much about the facts.
No, I was,
it was,
yeah, I was responding
yeah,
to
yeah,
Ken's
yeah.
introduction.
There are absences, but that, I mean, the 6 interviews that I did were really important in getting beyond the limits of the testimonies.
I mean, I'm also curious, I mean, if I could just ask a follow-up. So there's both the absences and then also, do you have a sense that, since they did create relationships that lasted, that some of this was about sort of a collective memory that they've been building over time? Or were your questions
Yeah,
sort of in
that's a very good question, and I struggle with that. The Israel guys in the Lodz group from 44 did have commemorations pretty regularly. And so I think there is a kind of collective memory that's a group reality for them. But some of them came to America and they didn't see each other except for very special occasions, weddings, bar mitzvahs, things like that. And mostly it was short telephone calls or things of that sort. So it's not the case with all of them that there's a communal memory. And you can make comparisons across the groups. Yeah, the last group does have a communal memory, and they nourish it as a communal memory. I think they wouldn't let each other get away with making claims that were contestable. So I think it's not tainted memory. It's just reinforcement.
I wouldn't, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say tainted memory. It's just, I wonder if the power of the school or the significance of the school is something that they highlight, right? And make into this kind of, right,
group.
Exactly, in a way that might not be the case for others, or that might be something that memory, especially in this kind of collective function, has sort of constructed in that kind of a way, that it might not be for an individual not involved in that kind of collective memory construction.
I think you've highlighted an important absence, right? They don't want to talk about the construction of the crematorium, which is entirely understandable, but the silence that
that's an imprecision that's calculated.
Yeah.
Is there anything, you brought up female orchestras, but I was curious, since it was only men who were involved in this, whether there are other kind of similar outlets that you know about that apply to women as being both places.
Or other workers, or other labor. I wondered both of those questions.
I'm working on the gypsy part of this now. In terms of women, there were prisoner functionaries who acted as nurses, who were able in some cases to, as part of their function of nursing, to create separate spaces, women's hospitals and things of that sort. There was a Kinderheim at Bergen-Belsen that was started by 3 nurses. Their job was, they had a little space because they, again, part of the functional operations of the camp, they were tasked to build a women's hospital. Bergen-Belsen was the place where people were being sent after Auschwitz was in the closing stages. And so they created a barrack in which children could be stashed and protected. And then they recruited other women who were a part of that and who were tasked to provide nursing services to kids. It wasn't secret. The SS was in and out of it. Irma Grisi held some of the kids on her lap. She was a famous war criminal after the war. Again, this kind of social history can reveal the camps as differentiated places with social spaces where some things other than what the Nazis wanted to have happen actually happened. Bergen-Belsen was also a place where there were a lot of women, so you would expect it to happen there. Brad?
So you said that this place was regularly checked by the SS. How often was Block 66 checked by the SS?
Not as often.
Yeah.
To get to the core thing. Every block in Buchenwald had a SS assigned to it. But the internal operations of the camp within the gate was run by the underground. It was run by the self-administration, which the underground controlled in Buchenwald. So the object was to run the camp in a disciplined way so the SS wouldn't come in. And the object with the boys was to keep them disciplined and not allow them to run and scavenge at all the garbage bales, because that would bring the SS in. The space was not checked regularly, except at roll call. And at roll call, there was a deal made with the SS in Block 66 to conduct it inside, away from the elements, away from the winter. It turned out, and I'm pretty sure about this now, that the SS guy was a Volksdeutsch from Czechoslovakia, and the head of the barrack was a communist from Czechoslovakia, and they had a personal deal going where the SS did not do what SS normally do in that barrack. And some of the kids knew this, and they saw him melt into the prisoner population after the liberation. So there was a deal there to, you know, I'll do this for you, and at the end of this, you'll protect me. So it's very different than Auschwitz. Auschwitz, the SS were in control all the time.
I wonder, what happens to these block elders, these men who are in charge of order and authority, once liberation evolved and they were creating these horrible tortures? Whatever happened to some of those people?
In a few cases I know of, there were trials after the war in Poland, and you could be brought up on trial as a prisoner functionary, although it was very hard to put prisoners on trial rather than Germans in SS. But I think Olszewski was prosecuted after the war. But in other cases, the prisoner functionaries, the block elders, melted into the prisoner population, and they got away after the war. They weren't called to account.
So if the SS used these murderers or criminals to train and control prisoners, none of them were ever reincarcerated?
Very few. In Israel, in the 40s and 50s, there was a law in the books to try capos and block elders who had brutalized prisoners and who had done the Nazis' bidding. So there's actually a law in the books that anticipated doing that, but very few trials came to be.
And I read a memoir by a French-Jewish engineer who described this hooking block where body parts were actually beaten and tortured until they came apart. Did you hear that in your testimony as well?
No, people don't go to that level.
They don't talk about this hooking block where people were tied.
Oh yeah.
Oh, they do.
Usually people were tied with their hands. They were hung with their hands tied behind their back. Yeah, that happened in every camp.
But in your testimony, they specifically talked about this hooking block in the school?
No.
Okay.
What they all talk about is getting cold water poured on them outside, which was horrific. And beatings, physical beatings. But the real threat of death was being taken away, not being beaten in the
HBK, is that how you? I didn't get that spelling, but.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.